why having teeth was basically a luxury in medieval times. Hey friend, tonight we drift back, far, far back, to a time when smiling was risky business, and biting into a piece of bread could end your week. We're traveling to the Middle Ages, where having a full set of teeth was not just rare, it was practically a social status. A dental miracle, really. Imagine this. It's the year 1295. You're sitting on a wobbly wooden stool in a smoky tavern. There's a crust of barley bread in your hand, and you're wondering, will this be the bite that finally breaks that last molar? You look around. No one's chewing. Everyone's gumming. Old men, young women, even children. Most have mouths like crumbling castle ruins. A few even carry little wooden teeth tied around their necks like lucky charms. Tonight we'll wander through this quiet and aching world together. We'll explore why dental hygiene was non-existent, how medieval people cleaned their mouths. Hint, they didn't. Why sugar made a surprise appearance centuries before toothbrushes did. And what happened when your only dentist was also your town's blacksmith. So, get cozy. Let the fire crackle, and prepare to learn why keeping your teeth in medieval times was, well, a luxury you probably couldn't afford. Crumbling smiles. Introduction to medieval dental suffering. The chill of a late autumn morning seeped through the ill-fitting shutters of Alaric's small wattle and daub hut. It clung to the damp earth floor, crept up the rough-hewn walls, and settled like a shroud over the meager belongings within. Alaric, a farmer whose seasons were etched into the lines on his face and the stoop of his shoulders, sat on a low stool by the dying embers of the hearth. His breath plumed white in the dim light. In his calloused hands he held a piece of bread, dark, dense, and stale from the previous day's baking. He raised it to his mouth, not with anticipation, but with a weary resignation. His gums ached, a familiar throbbing protest against the task ahead. Chewing was an ordeal, each movement a careful negotiation with the loose teeth and tender flesh that made up his crumbling smile. The bread, tough as old leather, required a determined, painful effort, a slow grinding that sent jolts of discomfort through his jaw. This was the silent, daily suffering of countless individuals in medieval Europe. A world where having a full set of healthy teeth was not just rare, it was practically a social status. A dental miracle, really. For most people in the medieval period, from the lowly peasant toiling in the fields to the artisan in a burgeoning town, oral health as we understand it today was simply beyond their reach. There were no gleaming dental offices, no preventative checkups, no tubes of minty paste promising protection. Knowledge of what caused teeth to decay, to ache, to fall out, was rudimentary at best, steeped in a mixture of folklore, humoral theory, and religious interpretation. The concept of dental hygiene was nascent, often limited to crude attempts at cleaning or masking the pervasive issue of bad breath. The tools and techniques available for dealing with dental problems were terrifyingly basic, often causing more harm than good and administered by individuals whose primary skills lay elsewhere. The village blacksmith, the local barber surgeon, individuals more adept at shaping iron or letting blood than at the delicate art of oral care. The very diet of the medieval populace was an assault course for the teeth. Coarse, stone-ground grains left grit in the bread, acting like an abrasive sandpaper against enamel. Fibrous vegetables, tough salted meats, And the general lack of soft, processed foods required vigorous, sustained chewing, putting immense strain on teeth and jaws. And while refined sugar was initially a rare commodity, its gradual spread, particularly among the wealthier classes, introduced a new and potent enemy to dental longevity. The link between diet and decay was not clearly understood, making prevention an almost impossible dream. So pain, therefore, was a constant companion. A dull ache in the jaw, a sharp, stabbing pain from an exposed nerve, the throb of an abscess. These were common experiences, endured with a stoicism born of necessity. Losing teeth was not a sign of age alone. It was a process that often began in youth, progressing relentlessly. A smile revealing gaps or teeth worn down to stumps was the norm, not the exception. The idea of a perfect smile, as promoted in our modern era, would have been an alien concept. Instead, the focus was often on managing pain, or on the social implications of decay, such as the foul breath that could isolate an individual or mar their reputation. This episode will delve into the quiet, often unrecorded suffering of medieval mouths. We will explore what they ate and how it wore down their teeth, the surprising arrival of sugar and its devastating impact on elite smiles, and what happened when your only dentist was also your town's blacksmith. We will uncover the rudimentary attempts at hygiene, the religious interpretations of dental pain, and the ingenious, sometimes bizarre ways people tried to cope with missing teeth or disguise the evidence of decay. It is a story of grit, both literal and metaphorical, of resilience in the face of constant discomfort, and how something we so often take for granted, a functional, relatively pain-free set of teeth, was, for many in medieval times, a luxury they probably couldn't afford. A fading memory in a world of crumbling smiles.
The medieval peasant's diet, born of necessity and the limitations of agricultural technology, was a formidable adversary to dental health. It was a regimen that, while often providing basic sustenance, subjected teeth to a relentless daily assault of abrasion, acidity, and sheer mechanical stress. Understanding what filled the average trencher or wooden bowl is key to understanding the widespread dental attrition and suffering of the era. Bread formed the cornerstone of this diet, but it was a far cry from the soft, refined loaves of today. The vast majority of peasants consumed bread made from coarse, stone-ground flours, rye, barley, oats, or a mixture known as maslin, wheat and rye. The milling process itself, using large millstones, inevitably introduced fine particles of grit, stone dust, and chaff into the flour. This grit, present in every mouthful of dense, chewy bread, acted like a relentless abrasive, slowly but surely wearing away the protective enamel of the teeth. Over years of consuming such bread, molars would become flattened, cusps worn smooth, and eventually the softer dentin beneath the enamel exposed, leading to sensitivity and an increased vulnerability to decay. The crusts of these peasant loaves were often particularly hard, baked in communal ovens or on hearthstones, requiring considerable force to break and chew, further stressing the teeth and jaw muscles. Beyond bread, the diet was heavily reliant on potterage, a thick stew or porridge that simmered for hours over the hearth. Its ingredients varied by season and availability, but often included grains, legumes like peas and beans, and whatever vegetables could be grown or foraged: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots. While seemingly softer, the grains within the pottage still carried their inherent grittiness. Furthermore, some common vegetables like sorrel were quite acidic, contributing to enamel erosion over time. Fruit, when available, was often consumed in its raw, acidic form. Apples, pears, plums, and wild berries. While providing valuable vitamins, the natural sugars and acids in these fruits, especially when oral hygiene was minimal, could create an environment conducive to decay, particularly if fruit pulp lodged between teeth. Meat, for the average peasant, was not a daily staple, but a more occasional addition, often reserved for feast days or when an animal was slaughtered. When consumed, it was frequently preserved through salting or smoking, methods that made the meat tough and chewy. Breaking down these sinewy, salt-laden fibers required prolonged, vigorous mastication, placing significant strain on the teeth and periodontal ligaments. Fish, similarly preserved, presented the same challenges. The effort of tearing and grinding such foods could exacerbate existing dental problems, loosen already compromised teeth, and contribute to chronic jaw pain or temporomandibular joint disorders. Dairy products, such as cheese and milk, were part of the diet, particularly in pastoral regions. While cheese could offer some buffering capacity against acids, the overall impact of the diet was heavily skewed towards the abrasive and acidic. Drinks, too, played a role. Water, often drawn from wells or streams of questionable purity, was the primary beverage. However, weak ale or cider were also common, consumed by adults and children alike, as they were often safer than untreated water. These fermented beverages, while low in alcohol, were acidic, and if sweetened with honey, a precious commodity, could further contribute to dental woes. The very act of eating was a more laborious process. Without the refined cutlery we use, food was often eaten with the hands or with a simple knife. Bones were gnawed clean, tough vegetable fibers meticulously chewed. This constant, demanding work for the teeth and jaws, combined with the inherently abrasive nature of the staple foods, meant that dental wear was almost universal. Teeth became tools, not just for eating, but for gripping and tearing in various crafts and daily tasks, adding another layer of stress. The peasant's mouth was a testament to a life of hard fare, a landscape slowly but surely ground down by the very sustenance that kept them alive.
Sweetness and status. Sugar's silent invasion. In the grand theater of medieval gastronomy, a new character made its entrance, arriving quietly at first, a whisper of exotic sweetness from distant lands. This was sugar, crystalline and white, a substance so rare and costly it was initially treated more like a spice or a medicine than a common foodstuff. Its arrival in Europe, facilitated by returning crusaders and expanding trade routes with the East, marked the beginning of a silent invasion, one that would eventually transform palates, economies, and, most insidiously, the dental health of those who could afford its allure. For centuries, honey had been the primary sweetener in Europe, its use tempered by its seasonal availability and the labor involved in its collection. Sugar, however, offered a concentrated, portable, and increasingly fashionable alternative. Initially, sugar was the preserve of the ultra-wealthy, royalty, high nobility, and the richest merchant families. It appeared in apothecaries' shops, prescribed in minute quantities for various ailments, its perceived medicinal properties adding to its mystique. Physicians believed it could balance the humors, aid digestion, or soothe a cough. But its true appeal lay in its unparalleled sweetness, a delightful novelty that quickly found its way into the kitchens of the elite. Confectioners, often employed in noble households, began to experiment with this new ingredient, creating elaborate sugary sculptures, marzipan figures, candied fruits, and sweet pasties. These subtleties, as they were sometimes called, were designed as much for display as for consumption. Ostentatious symbols of wealth and sophisticated taste at banquets and feasts. As sugar trickled down the social ladder, albeit slowly, it began to be incorporated more regularly into the diets of the affluent. It sweetened wines, was sprinkled over savory dishes, and became a key ingredient in desserts and preserves. This increasing consumption, however, came with an unforeseen and unwelcome consequence: a dramatic rise in dental caries, or tooth decay, among those who indulged its unforeseen and unwelcome consequence. The medieval understanding of decay was, as we shall explore, rooted in theories like the tooth worm, but the direct corrosive link between sugar and cavities was entirely unknown. Nobles and wealthy burghers who could afford this sugary onslaught began to suffer from rampant tooth rot at a rate unseen in populations subsisting on less refined, less sweet diets. The irony was potent. The very substance that signified status, luxury, and a refined palate was also a harbinger of pain, disfigurement, and foul breath. Portraits from the later medieval and early Renaissance periods sometimes offer glimpses of this dental devastation. While artists often idealize their subjects, occasionally a hint of blackened or missing teeth can be discerned, particularly in less formal depictions or in satirical works. Indeed, in some circles, particularly as sugar became more widespread in the 16th and 17th centuries, heavily decayed or blackened teeth, far from being a source of shame, could paradoxically become a grotesque badge of honor, an outward sign that one was wealthy enough to afford the sugary foods that caused such destruction. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for instance, was famously fond of sweets and suffered terribly with her teeth, a fact noted by contemporary observers. For the vast majority of the population, who still relied on honey sparingly or had no access to sugar at all, this particular wave of dental destruction passed them by, at least initially. Their teeth crumbled from grit and wear, but the rapid, aggressive decay fueled by refined sugar was largely a problem for the privileged. It was a silent, sweet poison, enjoyed in gilded halls and on silver platters, gradually eroding the smiles of Europe's wealthiest citizens. The sweetness they craved became a bitter architect of their dental demise.
The blacksmith dentist. Who pulled the teeth? When the throb of an infected tooth became unbearable, when the jaw swelled and sleep became impossible, the medieval sufferer had few places to turn. There were no dedicated dental practitioners in the modern sense. Instead, the grim task of tooth extraction often fell to individuals whose primary trade lay elsewhere, but whose strong arms and existing tools made them the reluctant, or sometimes enthusiastic, specialists in this brutal necessity. Chief among these were the village blacksmith and the barber surgeon. Imagine John, the blacksmith of Oakhaven, his forge glowing, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on anvil, a familiar sound in the village. His hands, large and calloused, were immensely strong, accustomed to shaping unyielding iron. It was this strength, and perhaps a basic set of tongs or pincers used in his metalwork, that qualified him in the eyes of his neighbors to deal with an offending tooth. When a villager, wild-eyed with pain, approached him, John would likely lead them not to a sterile surgery, but to a sturdy stool, perhaps in the open air of his smithy, or even in the village square if it was market day. The tools of this impromptu dentistry were fearsome. There were no delicate, precisely engineered instruments. Instead, the blacksmith might employ a pair of his regular iron tongs, perhaps slightly modified, or a crude levering tool called a pelican, named for its resemblance to the bird's beak, designed to hook under the tooth and wrench it upwards. Another common instrument was the dental key, which, when inserted and twisted, would ideally dislodge the tooth, though it often fractured the tooth, the jawbone, or neighboring teeth in the process. There was no concept of anesthesia as we know it. The patient might be given a strong draught of ale or wine, or perhaps a herbal concoction with mild sedative properties, but these did little to numb the searing pain of the procedure. Mostly it was a matter of grim endurance. The patient held down by friends or family, their head braced, while the dentist applied brute force. The extraction itself was a public spectacle as much as a medical procedure. If performed on market day, a crowd would often gather, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity, empathy, and perhaps a grim satisfaction in witnessing another's ordeal. Children might peek through the legs of adults, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The screams of the patient, the grunt of effort from the extractor, the sickening crunch of bone or tooth, these were the raw, unfiltered sounds of medieval tooth pulling. Infection was an ever-present risk. The blacksmith's tools were far from sterile, and the open wound left in the gum was an invitation to bacteria. Many died not from the extraction itself, but from the subsequent sepsis. Barber surgeons, found more commonly in towns and cities, also performed tooth extractions. Their trade already involved blades and minor surgical procedures like bloodletting, lancing boils, and setting bones, so tooth pulling was a natural extension of their services. They might possess slightly more specialized, though still terrifyingly crude instruments. Some itinerant tooth drawers also roamed the countryside, often charlatans, attracting crowds with flamboyant performances, promising painless extractions using secret techniques or magical charms, only to inflict agonizing pain and then quickly move on to the next village before their reputation caught up with them. These figures often wore necklaces, strung with extracted teeth, gruesome trophies of their trade. For the sufferer, approaching the blacksmith or barber surgeon was an act of utter desperation. It meant choosing the acute, terrifying pain of extraction over the chronic, debilitating agony of an infected tooth. There was no guarantee of relief, only the certainty of a brutal ordeal. The blacksmith dentist, with his strong hands and iron tools, was a figure of both fear and necessity, a stark embodiment of the crude, painful reality of dental care in a world where a simple toothache could become a life or death struggle. His forge, a place of creation and utility, also became, by necessity, a theater of agony.
Chewing in the dark. Oral hygiene before toothbrushes. In a world without the neatly packaged toothbrushes and fluoride toothpastes that line modern pharmacy shelves, the concept of oral hygiene in medieval times was a far more rudimentary and varied affair. While the understanding of dental disease was limited, people were certainly aware of the discomfort of food lodged between teeth, the unpleasantness of foul breath, and the visible signs of decay. Their attempts to address these issues, though often ineffective by our standards, offer a fascinating glimpse into daily life and the prevailing beliefs about cleanliness and health. The most basic form of cleaning involved simply rinsing the mouth with water. This might be done after meals, if water was readily available and clean, to try and dislodge food particles. However, the quality of water itself could be problematic, often drawn from potentially contaminated sources. For a more abrasive clean, people would use their fingers to rub their teeth or a piece of rough linen or woolen cloth. This could help to remove some surface debris, but was unlikely to effectively clean between teeth or along the gum line where problems often started. Nature provided some of the earliest toothbrushes. Twigs from certain trees and shrubs, with their ends frayed or chewed to create a bristly texture, were commonly used. Hazel, birch, and licorice root were popular choices, the latter having the added benefit of a pleasant taste and some perceived medicinal properties. These chew sticks could provide a degree of mechanical cleaning, and some plants even contained natural compounds with mild antiseptic or astringent qualities. However, their effectiveness was limited, and they could also be abrasive if used too vigorously. Powders for cleaning teeth, or at least for freshening breath, were also known, particularly among the more affluent or those with access to specialized knowledge such as monks or apothecaries. These tooth powders were typically made from a variety of ground or crushed ingredients. Common components included abrasive substances like crushed bone, chalk, pumice, or salt, which would have scoured the enamel. To this, fragrant herbs and spices might be added for taste and to combat bad breath. Mint, sage, rosemary, cinnamon, or cloves were popular. Sage in particular was widely believed to whiten teeth and strengthen gums. People might chew fresh sage leaves or rub them directly onto their teeth. Sometimes more astringent ingredients like powdered alum or myrrh were included, thought to tighten the gums. The efficacy of these powders was mixed. While the abrasives might remove some surface stains, they also risked damaging the enamel over the long term. The herbs and spices primarily masked bad breath rather than addressing its underlying causes, such as decay or gum disease. Some recipes for tooth powders or mouthwashes included rather more startling ingredients. Soot or charcoal were sometimes recommended for their supposed whitening properties. Perhaps most surprisingly to modern sensibilities, stale urine, particularly from a child or even imported from Spain, believed to be stronger, was sometimes used as a mouthwash, valued for its ammonia content, which was thought to have cleansing and whitening effects. This practice, while sounding repulsive now, persisted in some areas for centuries. Superstitions also played a role. Bad breath, or fuetor ex ore, was a significant social concern, often associated with moral corruption or inner rottenness as much as with physical ailment. Various charms or amulets might be worn to ward off bad breath or toothache. Certain foods were avoided, not necessarily because they were understood to cause decay, but because they were believed to generate evil humors that could affect the mouth. Ultimately, medieval oral hygiene was a patchwork of practical, if limited, cleaning methods, herbal remedies, and folk beliefs. A constant, often losing battle fought in the dark, both literally and figuratively, against the pervasive problems of the medieval mouth.
Saints and suffering. Toothaches in medieval religion. In the medieval worldview, where faith permeated every aspect of life, suffering was rarely seen as a purely physical or random occurrence. It was often imbued with spiritual significance, interpreted as a divine trial, a punishment for sin, a call to repentance, or even a path to sanctity. The agonizing pain of a toothache, so common and so debilitating, was no exception. It became a focal point for religious contemplation, a crucible in which faith was tested and refined, and a reason to seek the intercession of celestial helpers. The toothache, in its relentless, piercing torment, could feel like a direct assault from unseen forces. For some, it was a tangible manifestation of God's displeasure, a penance to be endured for past transgressions, real or imagined. Confession, prayer, and acts of charity might be undertaken in the hope of alleviating the divine wrath believed to be the source of the pain. For others, the suffering was seen as a participation in the passion of Christ, a way to share in his earthly agonies and thereby grow closer to God. In this light, the pain, however excruciating, could take on a redemptive quality, a sacred burden to be carried with patience and fortitude. The throbbing nerve became a memento mori, a reminder of the fragility of the flesh and the importance of preparing the soul for eternity. Central to the medieval experience of dental suffering was the figure of Saint Apollonia. A virgin martyr of the 3rd century from Alexandria, legend holds that during her persecution for her Christian faith, her teeth were violently pulled out or shattered. Because of the nature of her martyrdom, she became the patron saint of those suffering from toothache and other dental ailments. Her cult spread widely across Europe, and her intercession was fervently sought by those in the throes of dental agony.
Churches and chapels were dedicated to her, and her image, often depicted holding a pair of pincers with a tooth in their grip, became a familiar icon of solace. Sufferers would make pilgrimages to her shrines, light candles before her statue, and offer heartfelt prayers, begging her to intervene with God on their behalf, to ease their pain, or to grant them the strength to endure it. Small offerings, perhaps a coin if one could afford it, or a promise of future devotion would be made. The belief in the power of saintly intercession was profound. Saint Apollonia was seen as a compassionate advocate in the heavenly court, someone who understood the specific nature of their torment and could plead their case with particular efficacy. Sometimes relics associated with her, a fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, were venerated, believed to possess healing properties. The Church itself offered rituals and prayers for the relief of suffering, including specific benedictions against toothache. Priests might be called upon to bless the sufferer, to recite prayers, or to use holy water in an attempt to drive away the ailment, which was sometimes attributed to demonic influence as much as to natural causes. The lines between physical illness, spiritual affliction, and demonic attack were often blurred in the medieval mind. Thus, a toothache was not just a private misery. It was woven into the fabric of communal religious life. It prompted acts of piety, reinforced belief in the supernatural, and provided a framework for understanding and coping with a form of pain that was both intensely personal and universally dreaded. The suffering was real, the remedies often ineffective, but faith offered a context, a meaning, and a glimmer of hope, whether for earthly relief through the intervention of a saint like Apollonia, or for ultimate release in the pain-free realm of the afterlife. The throbbing tooth became a site of spiritual struggle, a painful reminder of humanity's fallen state, and a spur to seek solace in the divine.
The relentless progression of dental decay and tooth loss in medieval times profoundly impacted one of life's most fundamental activities, eating. As teeth loosened, ached, or fell out entirely, individuals were forced to adapt, to find ways to consume sustenance despite their compromised ability to chew. This often meant a change in diet, a modification of eating habits, and a quiet resignation to a world where the pleasures of the table were increasingly diminished, sometimes replaced by a feast of pain. For those with significant tooth loss, the once simple act of biting into a firm apple or tearing a piece of tough meat became an impossibility. Bread, the staple of most diets, presented a particular challenge. The hard, gritty crusts that characterized peasant loaves were formidable obstacles for tender gums or the few remaining, perhaps unstable, teeth. A common adaptation was to soak bread in whatever liquid was available: water, ale, wine, or the thin broth of a pottage. This softened the bread, making it easier to manage, breaking it down into a more digestible mush that could be swallowed with minimal chewing. The image of an elderly peasant or even a younger individual prematurely toothless, gumming at a sop of bread in their soup was a familiar one. When it came to chewing, individuals would instinctively favor the parts of their mouth that were still functional. If molars remained on one side, all food would be laboriously shifted to that quadrant for grinding. This could lead to uneven wear on the remaining teeth and strain on the jaw muscles. Some foods were simply avoided altogether. Tough, fibrous meats, raw vegetables, nuts, and anything requiring significant incisive action were gradually eliminated from the diet of those with severe dental issues. This could have nutritional consequences, leading to deficiencies if the softer, more manageable foods were less nutrient-dense. Even the wealthy, who had access to a wider variety of foods, were not immune. While their cooks might prepare softer dishes, tender roasted fowl, finely minced meats, custards, and purees, elaborate feasts could still present challenges. There are anecdotal records and observations from the period that describe guests at elite banquets struggling to eat the fare presented.
A noble lord or lady, despite their silks and jewels, might be seen discreetly trying to manage a piece of meat with sore gums, or subtly avoiding certain dishes altogether. The social pressure to maintain an appearance of effortless enjoyment, even amidst dental discomfort, would have been considerable. The experience of eating became less about pleasure and more about the functional necessity of ingesting enough calories to survive. Flavors might be dulled, textures lost. The satisfying crunch of a crisp vegetable or the hearty chew of well-cooked meat became distant memories. Instead, meals were often soft, bland, and monotonous. For those suffering from active tooth infections or abscesses, eating could be an agonizing ordeal, each mouthful sending waves of pain through the jaw. In such cases, individuals might subsist on liquids or very soft foods for extended periods, further weakening their already compromised bodies. Children, too, suffered. If their primary teeth decayed early, or if their permanent teeth erupted into a compromised environment, they learned from a young age to adapt their eating habits, perhaps unknowingly setting patterns that would affect their dental health for life. The community, in its way, also adapted. Food preparation in households with many toothless members might naturally tend towards softer, more easily consumed dishes. The feast of pain was not a specific event, but the ongoing, daily struggle to nourish a body with a mouth that was failing in its primary duty. It was a quiet, pervasive reality, a testament to the profound ways in which dental health, or the lack thereof, shaped the most basic aspects of medieval existence.
The toothworm theory. Early ideas of decay. In the shadowy recesses of medieval understanding, where empirical science had yet to fully illuminate the workings of the human body, the agonizing pain of a toothache often found its explanation in a creature both tiny and terrifying, the toothworm. This belief, ancient in its origins and remarkably persistent, held that tooth decay and the associated pain were caused by minuscule worms gnawing away at the tooth from within. It was a theory that resonated with the visual evidence of decay, the cavities that looked like burrows, the crumbling matter that resembled the castings of some unseen larva, and it provided a tangible, if incorrect, culprit for an otherwise mysterious affliction. This folkloric concept was not confined to peasant superstition. It permeated medical thinking for centuries. Learned physicians and scholars, drawing on classical texts from authorities like Galen and Pliny, often perpetuated the toothworm theory. Medical manuscripts from the medieval period sometimes contained illustrations depicting these supposed worms, small, writhing creatures, being coaxed or driven from an afflicted tooth. These images, while perhaps unsettling to the modern eye, offered a concrete, albeit erroneous, visualization of the problem, making the invisible enemy visible, and therefore, perhaps, more manageable. The belief in toothworms naturally shaped the treatments prescribed. If worms were the cause, then the cure must involve their expulsion or destruction. A variety of methods were employed, some based on fumigation, others on direct application of substances to the tooth. One common practice involved burning henbane seeds on hot coals and having the patient inhale the smoke through a funnel directed at the painful tooth. Henbane is a narcotic plant, and the smoke would indeed produce a temporary numbing effect. More dramatically, the small, dark seeds, when heated, would sometimes burst and writhe, appearing to the hopeful observer like the very worms being expelled from the tooth. This visual proof powerfully reinforced the theory. Other treatments aimed to draw out the worms. A poultice made of various ingredients, perhaps figs, pepper, and honey, or more pungent substances like garlic or onion, would be applied to the gum or cheek near the aching tooth. It was hoped that the properties of these ingredients would either kill the worms or encourage them to vacate the premises. Sometimes sharp instruments were used to probe the cavity, ostensibly to physically remove the worms, a procedure that likely caused immense pain and risked further infection.
Charms and incantations also played a significant role in worm-related therapies. A healer or wise woman might recite specific verses or prayers while performing a ritual, invoking divine or magical aid to banish the worms. These words themselves were believed to hold power, to be capable of influencing the unseen world of spirits, and by extension, the tiny creatures believed to be causing such misery. The toothworm, though a phantom, cast a long shadow over the medieval experience of dental pain, a tiny imagined tormentor at the heart of a very real agony.
Women and tooth rituals, beauty, breath, and suffering. For women in medieval society, particularly those in noble or aspiring households, the state of their teeth and breath carried significant social weight, intertwined with ideals of beauty, health, and even moral character. While dental suffering was universal, the pressures and remedies often took on gendered dimensions. A woman's smile, her speech, and the perceived sweetness of her breath were considered important attributes, and the struggle to maintain these in an era of rampant dental problems led to a variety of specific rituals and coping mechanisms. Beauty standards, though different from today's, still valued a pleasing countenance. While a full set of gleaming white teeth was an unrealistic expectation, overtly decaying, missing, or blackened teeth could detract from a woman's perceived attractiveness. This was especially pertinent in the context of marriageability, where a youthful and healthy appearance was prized. Consequently, women often went to greater lengths than men to conceal dental imperfections. A discreet hand held before the mouth when speaking or laughing, a lowered gaze, or the strategic use of veils or wimples could help to hide unsightly gaps or decay. The fashion for elaborate headdresses and veils, particularly among the nobility, may have offered a convenient way to partially obscure the lower face if desired. Foul breath, or halitosis, was a major concern, perhaps even more so than visible decay. Medical and social commentators of the period often linked bad breath to poor digestion, internal imbalance of humors, or even moral failings. For a woman whose virtue and purity were paramount, having sweet breath was considered essential. This led to a preoccupation with remedies aimed at perfuming the breath. Small scented comfits or cachous made with musk, ambergris, or aromatic spices like clove, cardamom, and aniseed were carried and discreetly chewed to mask odors. These were luxury items, indicative of status. Powdered clove, known for its strong, pleasant aroma and mild analgesic properties, might be rubbed on the gums or held in the mouth. Women's oral hygiene practices often involved fragrant herbs. Rinsing the mouth with rose water or water infused with mint, rosemary, or marjoram was common. Chewing on parsley or fennel seeds was another popular method for freshening breath. These practices, while not addressing the root causes of bad breath, like infection or decay, provided a temporary social palliative. Medical texts and household remedy books from the period often contained specific recipes for women's breath fresheners and tooth powders, sometimes emphasizing ingredients thought to enhance beauty, such as crushed pearls for the very wealthy, for whitening, or herbs believed to redden the lips and gums for a more youthful appearance. The suffering from toothache, of course, was no less acute for women. They too sought the intercession of Saint Apollonia and endured the brutal extractions offered by barber surgeons or blacksmiths. However, there might have been a greater tendency for women, especially within the domestic sphere, to rely on traditional, often female-administered herbal remedies and poultices passed down through generations. The wise woman or local herbalist often played a crucial role in providing palliatives for tooth pain. Pregnancy and childbirth, with their associated physiological changes and potential dietary shifts, could also exacerbate dental problems for women, a fact perhaps dimly recognized through observation, if not fully understood.
The old adage, "for every child a tooth lost," may have its roots in such historical realities where nutritional demands and hormonal changes, coupled with poor baseline dental health, took their toll. In essence, women in medieval times navigated a complex terrain where the physical realities of dental disease intersected with societal expectations of beauty and propriety. Their rituals and remedies were a blend of practical attempts at hygiene, cosmetic enhancements, and desperate measures to alleviate pain, all undertaken within a cultural context that placed a high premium on a woman's pleasing presentation, even amidst the pervasive suffering of the medieval mouth.
While the common peasant endured tooth loss with resignation or crude extractions, the wealthy elite of medieval society, driven by a desire to maintain appearances and alleviate the discomfort of missing teeth, sometimes had access to rudimentary forms of dental prosthetics and repairs. These early attempts at restorative dentistry were often ingenious, occasionally bizarre, and always expensive, marking a stark contrast to the dental fatalism of the lower classes. The materials used and the methods employed offer a curious window into the era's blend of craftsmanship, desperation, and limited medical understanding. The concept of a fake tooth was not entirely new, with ancient civilizations having experimented with replacements. In medieval Europe, these efforts were revived, albeit on a small scale. Ivory, often sourced from walrus or elephant tusks, was a favored material for carving artificial teeth. Bone, from humans or animals, was also used. These materials could be shaped and polished to vaguely resemble natural teeth, though matching the exact shade and translucency was impossible. Such artificial teeth were typically designed to fill visible gaps, particularly in the front of the mouth, for cosmetic rather than functional purposes. They were often uncomfortable, ill-fitting, and prone to discoloration or harboring bacteria, leading to further oral problems. Attaching these prosthetic teeth was a significant challenge. One common method involved using gold or silver wire, or sometimes silk ligatures, to bind the artificial tooth to adjacent healthy, or relatively healthy teeth. This was a delicate and expensive procedure, requiring a skilled artisan, perhaps a goldsmith or a particularly adept barber surgeon. The wires could cause irritation to the gums and put strain on the anchor teeth, sometimes leading to their eventual loosening and loss. However, for a wealthy individual concerned with their appearance at court or in high society, even a temporary, precarious fix was preferable to a conspicuous gap. Sometimes, instead of individually carved teeth, small bridges or partial dentures were constructed, again using ivory or bone, held in place by wires or by fitting snugly, if uncomfortably, against the remaining teeth and gums. There are even accounts of using human teeth, sourced from corpses or poor individuals willing to sell them, for transplantation or incorporation into dentures. The ethics and hygiene of such practices were, by modern standards, appalling. But in an era desperate for solutions, many avenues were explored. Gold, being malleable, resistant to tarnish, and a symbol of wealth, played a role beyond just wires. While true fillings, as we know them, were not common, there is some evidence of gold leaf being used to cover decayed areas or fill larger cavities, more for appearance and perhaps to seal off the decay than as a lasting restorative treatment. These would have been incredibly expensive and accessible only to the very rich. It's important to note that these display dentures, or wired-in teeth, were often not very functional for eating. They were primarily cosmetic, intended to be worn for social occasions. They might be removed for meals or at night. The idea of a comfortable, functional prosthetic that could restore full chewing ability was still centuries away. The focus was on mitigating the social embarrassment of visible tooth loss. These early attempts at dental repair highlight the ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval artisans, but also the profound limitations of their medical knowledge. The repairs were often temporary, uncomfortable, and could even exacerbate underlying problems. Yet, for those who could afford them, they offered a glimmer of hope, a way to reclaim a semblance of a normal appearance in a world where a crumbling smile was the pervasive norm. The gleam of gold wire in a noble's mouth or the carefully carved ivory tooth was a testament to the enduring human desire to overcome physical imperfection, even with the crude and costly tools available in the medieval age. Monastic mouths, the role of monks in medicine. In the often turbulent landscape of medieval Europe, monasteries stood as islands of relative stability, learning, and, importantly, repositories of medical knowledge, however rudimentary it might have been by modern standards. While not specialist dental practitioners, monks and the monastic orders played a significant, if sometimes indirect, role in the understanding and treatment of ailments, including the pervasive suffering of toothache. Their approach was a blend of classical learning, herbalism, religious faith, and practical necessity. Many monasteries maintained infirmaries, not just for their own sick brethren, but often extending charity to the surrounding lay community. Within these infirmaries, monks with a particular aptitude for healing would tend to the afflicted. Their medical knowledge was largely derived from translations of classical Greek and Roman texts, figures like Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides, which had been preserved and copied in monastic scriptoria for centuries. These texts contained theories on anatomy, physiology, often based on the system of humors, and materia medica, including descriptions of plants and their medicinal uses. Thus, a monk tending to someone with a toothache might consult these ancient authorities for guidance. Herbalism was a cornerstone of monastic medicine. Most monasteries cultivated extensive herbal gardens, known as hortus sanitatis, or physic gardens. Here they grew an array of plants believed to possess healing properties. For dental complaints, specific herbs were cultivated and prepared. Clove, with its analgesic eugenol, was well known and might be applied directly to an aching tooth or used in a mouth rinse. Sage was valued for its astringent and cleansing properties, often recommended for strengthening gums and whitening teeth. Plantain can be used in infusions to soothe inflammation, while plantain was sometimes applied as a poultice to reduce swelling. Monks meticulously documented these herbal remedies in manuscripts, creating herbals that listed plants, their properties, and instructions for their preparation and use. The monastic view of suffering, including tooth pain, was deeply intertwined with their religious beliefs. While they sought to alleviate pain through physical remedies, they also saw illness as having a spiritual dimension. Prayer, penance, and the invocation of saints like Apollonia were integral parts of the healing process. Pain was often viewed as a trial sent by God, an opportunity for spiritual growth, or a consequence of sin. Therefore, treatment involved not just tending to the body, but also to the soul. A monk might offer spiritual counsel alongside an herbal remedy. However, the direct intervention in terms of surgical procedures, like tooth extraction, was a more complex issue for the clergy. Church edicts at various times discouraged or even forbade clerics from performing tasks that involved the shedding of blood. Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The Church abhors bloodshed. This often relegated more invasive procedures to lay practitioners like barber surgeons. Monks might diagnose, prescribe herbal treatments, or oversee care, but the actual pulling of a tooth might be left to others, or performed only in dire necessity by a monk with specific dispensation or skills. Despite these limitations, monasteries were crucial centers for the preservation and cautious development of medical thought during the Middle Ages. Their libraries housed the knowledge of the past, their gardens provided the raw materials for remedies, and their infirmaries offered a space for care and observation. For the suffering individual with an aching tooth, a monastery might represent one of the few places where one could find some informed advice, a soothing herbal preparation, and spiritual comfort.
even if a definitive cure for their dental woes remained elusive. The monastic mouth, while subject to the same dietary and hygienic challenges as others, might at least have had access to a more considered, if still limited, approach to its care.
Decay and death when toothaches turned fatal. In an era devoid of antibiotics and with only the most rudimentary understanding of infection, a seemingly simple toothache could escalate into a life-threatening crisis. What began as a dull throb or a sharp pang, if left untreated or improperly managed, could progress to a severe infection, an abscess, and ultimately to systemic illness and death. For many in medieval times, the journey from a decaying tooth to the grave was a terrifyingly short and agonizing one. The initial stages of decay, the slow erosion of enamel and the formation of cavities, were often just the prelude. As bacteria penetrated deeper into the tooth, reaching the sensitive pulp containing nerves and blood vessels, the pain would intensify. This pulpitis, if unchecked, could lead to the death of the pulp tissue. The bacteria, now flourishing in the necrotic environment within the tooth, could then spread beyond the root tip into the surrounding bone, forming a dental abscess, a localized collection of pus, dead tissue, and bacteria. The signs were unmistakable: excruciating throbbing pain, often worse at night, swelling of the gum and often the face, sometimes distorting features dramatically, fever, chills, and a general feeling of malaise. At this point, the body's defenses were engaged in a desperate battle. Without effective drainage of the abscess or elimination of the infection source, the bacteria could continue to multiply and spread. The infection might track through the bone, leading to osteomyelitis of the jaw, a severe and difficult to treat bone infection. It could also spread into the soft tissues of the face, neck, and throat. Ludwig's angina, a rapidly progressing cellulitis of the floor of the mouth, could cause massive swelling that compromised the airway, leading to suffocation, a horrifying death. If the bacteria managed to enter the bloodstream, a condition known as bacteremia or septicemia, blood poisoning, could ensue. This was often a fatal turning point. The patient would experience high fever, rigors, rapid heart rate, confusion, and eventually organ failure and septic shock. Medieval physicians had no effective means to combat such systemic infections. Their treatments, bloodletting, purgatives, herbal concoctions, were powerless against the overwhelming bacterial onslaught. Historical records and skeletal analyses provide grim evidence of these fatal dental infections. Skulls from medieval burials sometimes show large abscess cavities in the jawbone, evidence of severe chronic infections. In some cases, the infection spread to the sinuses or even the brain, leading to meningitis or brain abscesses, conditions that were invariably fatal. A notable historical example, though from a slightly later period but reflecting the ongoing dangers, is King Henry I of England, who is believed by some historians to have died from complications following a dental infection after eating a surfeit of lampreys. While the exact cause is debated, it highlights how even the powerful were vulnerable. Imagine a villager in Oakhaven, their face grotesquely swollen, their body racked with fever, lying on a straw pallet. Their family watches helplessly, applying useless poultices, murmuring prayers. The local barber surgeon might have attempted a desperate, unhygienic lancing of an external swelling, or a brutal extraction of the offending tooth, but often this came too late, or introduced new pathways for infection. The patient's decline would be swift and agonizing. The quiet, somber tolling of the church bell would soon announce another victim claimed, not by war or plague in the dramatic sense, but by the silent, insidious spread of infection from a single, neglected tooth. The journey from a twinge of pain to the final breath was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the terrifying power of unseen microbes in a pre-antibiotic world.
Animal remedies and ritual cures. When the throbbing agony of a toothache became unbearable, and the more conventional, though still crude, methods offered by barber surgeons or herbalists failed to bring relief, the medieval sufferer might turn to a world of more esoteric cures, a realm where folk magic, animal lore, and ancient rituals held sway. These remedies, often bizarre and surreal to the modern mind, reflected a deep-seated belief in sympathetic magic, the power of amulets, and the interconnectedness of the natural and supernatural worlds. They were acts of desperation, born from a desire to control an often uncontrollable pain. The animal kingdom was a rich source of supposed dental remedies. It was widely believed that parts of certain animals, or substances derived from them, possessed specific virtues that could be transferred to the sufferer. Wearing an amulet made from a badger tooth, for example, was thought to protect against toothache or alleviate existing pain. The logic, perhaps, was that the strong teeth of the badger could impart their resilience. Similarly, a wolf's tooth, or even dust scraped from one, might be carried or applied to the aching area. The fat of a dormouse rubbed onto the gums was another prescribed remedy in some folk traditions. Frogs featured prominently in some of the stranger cures. One particularly unsettling practice involved spitting into a frog's mouth while reciting a charm, with the belief that the frog would then carry away the toothache. In another variation, a live frog might be held against a cheek or even boiled, and the resulting concoction used as a mouthwash or poultice. The thinking behind such remedies is obscure, likely rooted in ancient beliefs about transference of illness to an animal scapegoat, or the perceived cold nature of amphibians counteracting the heat of inflammation. Insects, too, played their part. The toothworm theory naturally led to remedies involving creatures that might be seen as analogous. For instance, ladybirds, when crushed, were sometimes applied to an aching tooth, perhaps with the hope that they would consume the mythical worms. Earthworms, dried and powdered, might be mixed into a paste for similar application. Beyond animal parts, ritual actions and spoken charms were integral to many folk cures. The timing of these rituals was often crucial, perhaps performed at a specific phase of the moon, at a crossroads, or by a running stream. Whispering a specific incantation while touching the aching tooth, or while performing a symbolic action like driving a nail into an oak tree, transferring the pain to the tree, was common. These charms were often a blend of garbled Latin, local dialect, and references to saints or biblical figures, passed down orally through generations. The power was believed to lie not just in the words themselves, but in the precise manner of their delivery and the intention of the speaker. Some cures involved what might be termed shock therapy. Touching the aching tooth with a tooth taken from a corpse was believed to transfer the pain to the dead, who could no longer feel it. Alternatively, visiting a gallows and taking a splinter of wood or moss growing there to apply to the tooth drew on the grim power associated with such places of death. These remedies, while appearing utterly irrational to us, existed within a worldview where the boundaries between the physical, magical, and spiritual were porous. They represented an attempt to engage with the mysterious forces believed to influence health and illness. For the medieval peasant, racked with pain and with few effective options, trying a cure involving a boiled frog or a whispered charm was perhaps no more outlandish than facing the blacksmith's tongs. It was all part of a desperate search for relief in a world where suffering was common and understanding was scarce.
Toothache and the church bell. Time, pain, and prayer. In the medieval village, the church bell was more than a mere timepiece. It was the metronome of daily life, its resonant calls punctuating the hours of labor, prayer, and rest. For someone enduring the relentless torment of a toothache, the sound of that bell took on a particularly poignant, almost hypnotic quality. Each strike could mark another agonizing hour passed, another period of suffering endured, or another call to prayer, offering a fleeting, structured moment for supplication amidst the chaos of pain. Imagine the darkness of a medieval night, deep and encompassing, broken only by the faint glow of dying embers in the hearth. A villager, let us call him Thomas, lies awake, his jaw throbbing with an intensity that seems to fill the small hut. Sleep is impossible. Every nerve in his head seems to scream in protest. In this isolating darkness, the distant, solemn toll of the monastery bell, or the village church bell striking the watches of the night, Compline, matins, lauds, would drift through the stillness. Each clang was a marker in his personal Via Dolorosa. He might count the strikes, not to know the hour for any practical purpose, but as a way to measure his own endurance, to tick off the slow, agonizing passage of time until dawn might bring some small change, some distraction, or the courage to seek help. The rhythm of the monastic hours, or the simpler calls to prayer in the parish, provided a framework for his suffering. As the bell called the monks or the faithful to their knees, Thomas, in his own solitary agony, might join them in spirit. His prayers would be raw, urgent, stripped of formality. Domine, exaudi orationem meam. Lord, hear my prayer. Miserere mei Deus. Have mercy on me, O God. The pain itself became a form of prayer, an offering, a desperate plea rising from the depths of his being. The bell's call to prayer transformed the lonely, isolating experience of pain into a shared, albeit remote, moment of communion with the divine and with the wider community of faith. During the day, the bell continued its cadence. The call to sext or midday prayer might find Thomas unable to work, huddled in his hut, the pain a relentless companion. The sound of the bell might remind him of others in the village, also pausing from their labors, also perhaps carrying their own burdens. There was a sense in which the bell universalized suffering, placing individual pain within the larger context of a community bound by shared faith and shared rituals. The tolling for Mass on Sunday, or for a specific feast day like that of St. Apollonia, would carry particular weight. The journey to church, if he could manage it, would be a pilgrimage of pain. The prayers offered within the stone walls, surrounded by fellow sufferers or those who had known such suffering, would be intensified by his immediate experience. The bell that called him there was a summons to seek solace, to lay his burden before the altar, even if physical relief was not forthcoming. Even the secular rhythms marked by some bells, the opening or closing of market gates, the curfew, could intersect with the experience of toothache. A curfew bell might signal the end of a long day of endured pain and the beginning of another dreaded night. A market bell might remind him of the bustling world outside his suffering, a world he could not fully participate in while in such agony. The church bell, then, was not just an indifferent marker of time for the person with a toothache. It was an active participant in their experience, its sounds woven into the very fabric of their pain and their prayers. It was a constant reminder of the passage of time, each segment endured, and a recurring invitation to frame that suffering within the comforting, structuring rhythms of faith and communal life. The hypnotic, repetitive tolling became a soundtrack to their endurance, a somber lullaby for a night of pain, or a faint, distant promise of eventual peace.
What nobility could afford, and still couldn't fix.
The chasm between the noble and the peasant in medieval society extended even into the intimate realm of dental health. Yet wealth, while offering palliatives and illusions, could not ultimately conquer the pervasive decay of the era. The nobility, with their access to imported luxuries, specialized artisans, and a diet increasingly sweetened by exotic sugars, found themselves in a paradoxical situation, able to afford attempts at cosmetic repair and pain relief, yet often suffering from even more aggressive dental problems than their poorer counterparts, and fundamentally unable to prevent or truly fix the underlying issues. A noble lord or lady, faced with the embarrassment of a missing front tooth or the agony of an abscess, had options unavailable to the peasant. They could summon a barber-surgeon of higher repute, one perhaps attached to a royal court or a wealthy urban center, who might possess finer, if still terrifying, instruments. They could afford the gold wire needed to bind a carved ivory or bone replacement tooth, a small, costly deception to maintain a pleasing facade during courtly gatherings. Such a prosthetic, as noted by contemporary accounts or gleaned from aristocratic diaries, was often more for show than function, removed for the practicalities of eating or sleeping. It was a testament to the importance of appearance, a carefully constructed illusion of wholeness. Their diet, a double-edged sword, contributed significantly to their woes. While the peasants' teeth were worn down by grit, the nobles were increasingly attacked by sugar. The arrival of cane sugar in Europe transformed aristocratic cuisine. Elaborate desserts, candied fruits, sweet wines, and marzipan sculptures graced their tables. This constant exposure to sugar, combined with often no better understanding of oral hygiene than the peasantry, created a perfect storm for rampant caries. Queen Elizabeth I of England, though living at the cusp of the early modern period, famously had teeth blackened by sugar, a condition noted with some dismay by foreign ambassadors. This was the price of indulgence. To combat the inevitable foul breath that accompanied such decay, the nobility had access to more refined and expensive remedies. They could afford imported spices like cloves, cinnamon, and mace, which were chewed or used in scented waters to perfume the breath. Musk and ambergris, rare and costly animal products, were incorporated into lozenges or powders. They might use tooth scrapers made of silver or ivory and rub their teeth with powders containing crushed pearls or coral, believing these expensive substances had superior whitening or strengthening properties. Silk threads might be used to clean between teeth, a luxury far beyond the reach of someone using a frayed twig. Yet despite these expenditures, true prevention or effective restoration remained elusive. The underlying causes of decay were misunderstood. There was no concept of removing decay and filling a tooth to preserve it. Extraction was still the primary solution for an unbearably painful tooth, and even for a noble, this was an agonizing, unanesthetized procedure, albeit perhaps performed with slightly more finesse or in more private surroundings. Infection remained a deadly risk for all. Art of the period reflects this reality, albeit subtly. While portraitists typically idealize their subjects, hints of dental imperfection can sometimes be found. More telling are the often closed-lipped expressions or the strategic use of veils and shadows around the mouth. Personal letters or diary entries from the era sometimes allude to the misery of toothache, the embarrassment of missing teeth, or the quest for remedies. They revealed that wealth could purchase sweeter foods that rotted teeth faster, gold wires to hold false teeth in place, and fragrant spices to mask the odor of decay. But it could not buy immunity from the fundamental dental afflictions of the age. The noble mouth, though perhaps adorned with superficial fixes, was often as much a site of suffering and decay as any other, a poignant reminder that some miseries, in medieval times, transcended even the deepest coffers. The child's mouth. Decay begins early. The small cottage was filled with the low, rhythmic sounds of a mother humming an old lullaby. Ilara held her youngest, 6-year-old Thomas, close, rocking him gently. But it wasn't a restless energy she was trying to soothe. It was the persistent, miserable ache in his small jaw. His cheek was slightly swollen, warm to her touch, and tears tracked silently down his face, illuminated by the flickering light of the single tallow dip. His breath, usually sweet with the innocence of childhood, carried a faint, sour odor that worried her deeply. Decay, the unwelcome visitor to so many mouths in their village of Oakhaven, had claimed a hold in Thomas's small mouth even before all his baby teeth had given way to their adult successors. For children in medieval times, the journey of dental health often began on a precarious footing. While breastfeeding could offer some initial protection, the introduction of solid foods, often the same coarse, gritty bread and sugary fruits, when available, consumed by adults, exposed their developing teeth to early challenges. Honey, a common sweetener for children's pap or to soothe a cough, could cling to tooth surfaces, fueling the invisible agents of decay. Understanding of the importance of cleaning a baby's or young child's teeth was virtually non-existent. Parents, struggling with their own dental afflictions and the overwhelming demands of daily survival, had little knowledge or capacity to focus on preventative oral care for their offspring. So it was not uncommon for a child like Thomas to suffer from cavities in his primary teeth. These milk teeth were often seen as temporary, their loss inevitable, and so their decay might have been met with a degree of resignation. Yet the pain was no less real for the child. A young boy, unable to articulate the precise nature of his discomfort, could only cry, refuse food, or point vaguely to his aching face. His mother, Ilara, would try traditional remedies, a poultice of warm herbs on his cheek, a gentle rubbing of clove oil, if she was fortunate enough to have some, on the sore gum, or perhaps a whispered charm her own mother had taught her. She might encourage him to rinse his mouth with salted water or a sage infusion. The consequences of early decay extended beyond immediate pain. Infected baby teeth could affect the development of the permanent teeth forming beneath them. Premature loss of primary teeth due to decay could lead to crowding or misalignment of the adult dentition, creating new areas for food to trap and further problems down the line. Moreover, a child suffering from chronic dental pain was likely to eat poorly, affecting their overall growth and development, their energy levels, and their ability to learn or play. Their nights would be disturbed, their days shadowed by discomfort. There was a quiet tragedy in this acceptance of early dental suffering. Families, observing the widespread tooth loss and decay in adults around them, perhaps came to view it as an unavoidable part of life, a burden to be borne from a young age. The idea that a child could grow to adulthood with a full set of healthy teeth would have seemed an unlikely, almost fantastical prospect. The village barber surgeon, if resorted to for a child, would face the heart-wrenching task of extracting a tiny infected tooth from a terrified, screaming child held firmly by distraught parents. The trauma of such an experience could last a lifetime. Ilara continued to hum, her heart aching in sympathy with her son's pain. She had no real solutions, only love and the limited comforts her folk knowledge could provide. She might pray to Saint Apollonia or Saint Nicholas, patron of children, for relief. But mostly she would endure with him, sharing his quiet suffering, a silent acknowledgement of the fragility of childhood health in a world where even the simple act of growing teeth was fraught with peril. The child's mouth, so new to the world, was already a battleground where the forces of decay often began their relentless work far too early. Dentistry and execution, the shared tools of torture. In the grim landscape of medieval justice and rudimentary medicine, a disturbing overlap sometimes existed between the tools and techniques used for punishment and those employed for healing, particularly in the realm of tooth extraction. The line between alleviating suffering and inflicting it could become uncomfortably blurred, especially when viewed through the lens of the instruments themselves. Pliers, levers, and hooks designed to grip, pull, and manipulate could serve the hands of both the torturer and the desperate tooth drawer, their function dictated by intent, but their capacity for inflicting agony remarkably similar. Consider the tools of the executioner or the state-sanctioned torturer. Instruments designed for crushing limbs, extracting confessions, or inflicting maximum pain often bore a chilling resemblance to those found in the kit of a barber surgeon or even a blacksmith pressed into dental service. Pincers, for instance, were a common tool in both arsenals. For the torturer, they might be used to grip flesh, tear at sinews, or remove fingernails. For the tooth drawer, similar, if perhaps slightly more refined, pincers were used to grasp an offending tooth, often with brutal force, to wrench it from its socket. The pain inflicted, though for different purposes, could be equally excruciating. The pelican, a common medieval dental instrument named for its beak-like shape, was designed to hook under a tooth and lever it out. Its mechanical action, involving leverage and force applied to a small, sensitive area, was not dissimilar to that of certain implements of torture designed to pry or dislocate. Similarly, the dental key, which applied rotational force to dislodge a tooth, could, if misused or if the tooth was firmly rooted, easily fracture the jawbone, an injury that might also be inflicted intentionally in a punitive context. The sound of cracking bone, the tearing of ligaments, these were experiences common to both the extraction chair and the torture chamber. Moreover, the public nature of both tooth extractions and executions in medieval times created a shared spectacle of suffering. Just as crowds might gather to witness a hanging or a public flogging, they would also congregate to watch the tooth drawer at work, especially if it was an itinerant practitioner making a show of his craft. The screams, the blood, the visible agony, these were elements common to both public punishment and public healing. This desensitization to, or even morbid fascination with, physical suffering was a characteristic of the age. The context of power is also relevant. An individual facing the executioner's tools was at the mercy of the state's authority. An individual facing the tooth drawer's instruments was, in a sense, also surrendering to a power, the power of unbearable pain, and the perceived power of the practitioner to alleviate it, however brutally. In both scenarios, the patient or victim was often restrained, helpless, their body subjected to the will and actions of another. It is not to say that barber surgeons were intentionally torturous in their dental work. Their aim was, however crudely, to alleviate suffering. However, the lack of anesthesia, the rudimentary nature of the tools, and the often brutal techniques meant that the experience of a difficult tooth extraction could feel akin to torture for the unfortunate patient. The shared visual and mechanical language of the tools themselves, cold, hard metal, designed to grip, twist, and pull at the human body, speaks to a certain pragmatism and a grim acceptance of pain that characterized the medieval approach to both justice and medicine. The smithy's tongs, the executioner's pincers, different functions perhaps, but forged in the same era of iron will and iron implements, where the boundaries between help and harm were sometimes unsettlingly thin.
Urban versus rural tooth survival. The dental fortunes of medieval individuals were not uniform across the landscape. Significant, if subtle, differences likely existed between those living in burgeoning urban centers and their counterparts toiling in the rural countryside. These variations were influenced by a complex interplay of diet, access to water, population density, and the availability of even rudimentary forms of care or specialized goods. While tooth decay and loss were pervasive everywhere, the specific patterns and contributing factors could shift with the environment. In rural areas, like the imagined hamlet of Oakhaven, the diet, as previously discussed, was heavily reliant on coarse, stone-ground grains. This resulted in significant abrasive wear on the teeth from a young age. However, access to refined sugar was generally very limited for the peasantry. Honey was the primary sweetener, used more sparingly. This might have meant that while teeth were worn down, the rapid, aggressive carious decay fueled by frequent sugar consumption was less prevalent than it would become in urban centers among certain classes. Rural populations often had access to fresh, foraged greens and fruits in season, which, while sometimes acidic, also provided vitamins. Water sources, though variable, might in some isolated areas be cleaner than in densely populated towns, potentially reducing exposure to certain waterborne contaminants that could indirectly affect overall health, including oral health. Access to folk healers and wise women with their knowledge of herbal remedies for toothache was common in village settings. Urban environments presented a different set of challenges and, for some, opportunities. Towns and cities were centers of trade, meaning that imported goods, including sugar, became earlier and more readily available, at least to merchants, artisans, and the wealthier citizenry. This increased sugar consumption, even if still modest by modern standards, likely led to a higher incidence of dental caries in these urban groups compared to their rural contemporaries who had little to no access to refined sugar. The urban diet might also include more processed foods, white bread made from finer flour for those who could afford it, which, while less abrasive, could be more cariogenic if combined with sugar. Water quality in medieval towns was often notoriously poor. Rivers and wells could be contaminated with human and animal waste, industrial runoff from crafts like tanning or dyeing, and general refuse. This poor sanitation could lead to widespread systemic illnesses, which in turn could weaken the body's ability to fight off oral infections. While it's difficult to draw direct causal links between specific water contaminants and dental decay in the medieval context, overall health status certainly played a role. On the other hand, urban centers offered a greater concentration of specialized practitioners. Barber surgeons, who performed tooth extractions and other minor surgical procedures, were more numerous in towns. Apothecaries, selling herbs, spices, and prepared remedies, including tooth powders or mouthwashes, were also urban fixtures. Thus, an urban dweller with a toothache might have had more options for seeking professional help, however crude, than a peasant in a remote village who relied solely on the blacksmith or a local herbalist. Access to markets also meant a wider variety of potential ingredients for oral hygiene preparations, such as imported spices like cloves or cinnamon, could be purchased by those with means. Skeletal studies comparing medieval urban and rural populations sometimes reflect these differences. For example, some studies have found higher weights of caries in urban populations assumed to have greater access to sugary foods, while rural populations may show more evidence of severe occlusal wear. But these findings can vary depending on the specific site, time period, and socioeconomic status of the individual studied. The picture is complex, but it is clear that the environmental and economic context, the grit in the rural loaf versus the sugar in the urban delicacy, the village well versus the town river, the folk healer versus the gilded barber surgeon, shaped the dental destinies of medieval people in distinct ways.
Smiling in portraits, art, vanity, and dental shame. When we gaze upon the faces that stare out at us from medieval and early Renaissance portraits, we are often struck by their solemnity. Smiles are rare, and when they do appear, they're usually subtle, closed-lipped affairs. This artistic convention was not merely a reflection of a somber worldview or a lack of joie de vivre. It was also deeply intertwined with prevailing aesthetic ideals, social decorum, and quite significantly, the widespread reality of poor dental health and the associated shame or desire to conceal imperfections. The technical challenges of portraiture in the medieval period certainly played a role. Capturing a fleeting, open-mouthed smile with the slow, deliberate painting techniques of the era was difficult. A serene, composed expression was easier to render, and was also seen as befitting the dignity and status of the sitter, who was often a person of wealth and importance, a noble, a cleric, or a prosperous merchant. Lavish attention was paid to the depiction of luxurious fabrics, intricate jewelry, and symbols of lineage or piety. The face was often treated with a similar gravity, aiming for an idealized representation rather than a candid snapshot. However, the state of medieval mouths undoubtedly influenced these artistic choices. With dental decay, tooth loss, and discoloration being so common across all strata of society, an open-mouthed smile risked revealing a landscape of crumbling, stained, or missing teeth. This was hardly conducive to the image of power, beauty, or piety that the patron usually wished to project. Therefore, a closed-lipped expression, or one where the lips were only slightly parted, became the norm. It was a discreet way of masking potential dental flaws, presenting a more uniformly pleasing and dignified visage to the world and to posterity. Consider the ideals of beauty prevalent at the time. While standards varied, a certain regularity of features and a pleasing complexion were generally admired. Teeth, if visible, were ideally small, even, and white, an almost impossible standard for most. Since this ideal was so rarely met, it was often safer from an aesthetic standpoint to keep the mouth closed. Bad breath, another pervasive consequence of poor oral health, though not directly visible in a painting, was a significant social concern. A closed mouth in a portrait could subtly imply a certain decorum and cleanliness, even if the reality was different. There are, of course, exceptions. Some later medieval or early Northern Renaissance works, particularly those depicting common folk, peasants, or satirical scenes, might show individuals with more expressive, open mouths, sometimes revealing the very dental imperfections that formal portraiture sought to conceal. These instances, however, often serve to highlight the difference in social standing, or to make a specific moral or humorous point. In formal, commissioned portraits, the aim was generally elevation and idealization. The use of veils, wimples, and high collars in women's fashion, and beards in men's, could also serve to partially obscure the lower face and mouth, further reducing the need to depict potentially problematic dental features. While these fashions had multiple cultural and practical origins, they could also conveniently contribute to the overall aesthetic of a concealed or understated mouth. Thus, the serious faces and closed lips that dominate medieval portraiture are a complex tapestry woven from artistic convention, social etiquette, and the unspoken realities of dental suffering. They're a silent testament to a time when revealing one's teeth could be a source of social anxiety or aesthetic displeasure. The portraits, in their solemnity, inadvertently capture an era's collective dental shame, or at least its prudent discretion, choosing to present a composed, unrevealing facade to the scrutinizing gaze of the viewer.
The alchemy of breath, halitosis and herbal obsession. In the close confines of medieval life, where personal space was often limited and social interactions were paramount, the quality of one's breath held significant weight. Halitosis, or foul breath, was a pervasive affliction, a natural consequence of rampant dental decay, gum disease, poor digestion, and rudimentary oral hygiene.
It was more than just a physical discomfort. It was a social impediment, sometimes even seen as an outward sign of inner imbalance or moral failing. This led to a veritable obsession with masking bad breath, a kind of alchemy of breath, where individuals sought to transform offensive odors into pleasant aromas through a vast pharmacopoeia of herbs, spices, and curious concoctions. Imagine a bustling medieval marketplace or a crowded great hall during a feast. The air would be thick with a myriad of smells: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animals, cooking food, and undoubtedly the collective breath of the assembled company. To stand out for having particularly offensive breath could lead to social ostracism, ridicule, or damage to one's reputation. Thus, the quest for sweet-smelling breath was a serious and ongoing endeavor, especially for those in polite society or those whose professions required close contact with others. The primary weapons in this aromatic arsenal were herbs and spices, prized for their strong, pleasant scents. Mint, with its cool, refreshing aroma, was a universal favorite. Leaves would be chewed fresh or dried and powdered to be used in mouth rinses or as a part of a tooth powder. Sage, often associated with cleanliness and wisdom, was another staple, its leaves rubbed on teeth and gums or infused in water. Rosemary, thyme, and marjoram, with their pungent, savory notes, were also employed. These herbs didn't cure the underlying cause of halitosis, but they offered a temporary masking effect, a fragrant veil over the unpleasant reality. For those who could afford them, imported spices offered more exotic and potent solutions. Cloves, with their warm, sweet, and powerfully aromatic profile, and their natural analgesic properties, were highly valued. A single clove held in the mouth or chewed gently could perfume the breath for a considerable time. Cinnamon bark, cardamom pods, aniseed, and fennel seeds were similarly used, either chewed whole or incorporated into comfits and lozenges. These were luxury items, their use a subtle display of wealth as much as a hygienic practice. Mouthwashes were concocted, often with a wine or vinegar base infused with aromatic herbs. Wine, with its alcohol content, might have had some mild antiseptic effect, while vinegar, being acidic, could temporarily alter the oral environment. Rosewater, a fragrant distillation, was a popular choice for a more delicate mouth rinse, particularly among ladies of rank. These rinses aimed to leave a lingering, pleasant scent and a feeling of freshness, however fleeting. Beyond herbs and spices, other, sometimes more unusual substances were employed. Myrrh and frankincense, resins known for their use as incense, were sometimes used in oral preparations for their fragrance and perceived purifying qualities. Chewing on a piece of licorice root provided both a sweet taste and a fibrous texture for cleaning. Some recipes even suggested chewing on mastic, a resin from the mastic tree known for its ability to freshen breath and strengthen gums. The medieval obsession with masking bad breath highlights a keen awareness of its social consequences, even if the understanding of its causes was limited. It was a daily, often experimental effort to manage an almost universal problem. The alchemy of breath was about transformation, taking the foul and making it fragrant, using the bounty of the herb garden and the spice merchant's stall to create a more socially acceptable and personally comfortable oral atmosphere. It was a fragrant battle fought with leaves and seeds, a constant striving for sweetness in a world often marked by decay.
The tooth, that small, seemingly insignificant part of the human anatomy, casts a surprisingly long shadow in the landscape of medieval literature. Its presence is felt not just as a physical entity, but as a potent symbol of pain, mortality, human frailty, and even moral character. From didactic religious tales and chivalric romances to bawdy fabuloe and medical treatises,
The aching tooth and the gapped smile make their appearance, reflecting the era's lived experience and its anxieties surrounding this common affliction. In religious writings and saints' lives, tooth pain often served a didactic purpose. The story of Saint Apollonia, as previously mentioned, is a powerful example. Her martyrdom by tooth extraction becoming a powerful narrative of faith enduring extreme suffering. For ordinary individuals, toothache could be framed as a divine trial or a punishment for sin. A medieval sermon might warn, "As the worm gnaws the tooth from within, so does sin devour the soul of the unrepentant." Here, the physical decay of the tooth becomes a potent metaphor for spiritual corruption. Prayers and penitential literature would offer solace and a path to redemption, linking physical suffering with spiritual discipline. Medical texts and encyclopedias of the period, while not literature in the narrative sense, often contained vivid, if sometimes gruesome, descriptions of dental ailments and their supposed cures. These writings, frequently drawing on classical sources or folklore like the toothworm theory, contributed to the cultural understanding, or misunderstanding, of dental problems. A passage might describe the evil humors that cause teeth to rot, or detail the agonizing procedure of extraction with a pelican or key, inadvertently creating a kind of medical horror story. In chivalric romances and epic poems, the physical perfection of heroes and heroines was often emphasized, though direct mention of teeth might be sparse unless to highlight a particular flaw or, conversely, an ideal. A beautiful lady might be praised for her breath as sweet as mayflowers, a subtle nod to good oral and general health, which was itself an indicator of purity and good breeding. Conversely, a villain or a grotesque character might be described with broken, blackened, or missing teeth, symbolizing their moral decay or brutish nature. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, for instance, provides a gallery of vivid characters, and while not always explicit about dental status, the wife of Bath's gap-toothed smile is famously noted, presented not as a flaw, but as a mark of her amorous and assertive character, subverting typical beauty standards. Fabulots, the short, often bawdy and satirical narrative poems popular in the later Middle Ages, sometimes used dental problems for comic or grotesque effect. An old lecherous man trying to woo a young maiden might be mocked for his toothless gums or foul breath, his physical decay mirroring his inappropriate desires. The pain of a toothache could also be a source of slapstick humor or a plot device, leading to comical misunderstandings or misfortunes. Even in legal documents or chronicles, incidental mentions of dental issues can offer glimpses into daily suffering. A manorial record might note a peasant excused from labor due to a grievous ache of the teeth. A chronicler might describe a noble afflicted by a swollen jaw, unable to attend to state affairs. These small details, embedded in larger narratives, paint a picture of how dental pain permeated all levels of society. The tooth in medieval literature, therefore, is more than just a body part. It is a site of intense physical suffering, a mirror for spiritual states, a marker of social status or moral character, and occasionally a source of dark humor. Its appearances, though sometimes fleeting, remind us that the anxieties and agonies of the medieval mouth were deeply woven into the cultural and imaginative fabric of the age, finding expression in the stories they told, the remedies they sought, and the lessons they imparted.
Winter and the ache. Cold's effect on the mouth. Winter in medieval Europe was a season of hardship, a time when the world shrank and survival became a more acute concern. For those already suffering from dental ailments, the biting cold of winter brought an additional layer of misery, transforming a persistent ache into an agonizing torment.
The frigid air, the damp chill that seeped into homes, and the general physiological stress of the season could exacerbate existing tooth pain and create new problems for already vulnerable mouths. Imagine a peasant family huddled around a meager fire in their drafty, single-room hut in Oakhaven. The wind howls outside, rattling the ill-fitting shutters, and fine, powdery snow sometimes finds its way through cracks in the wattle and daub walls. For someone like Old Man Hemlock, whose teeth were already worn down to sensitive stumps, or for young Martha, nursing a loose molar, every breath of icy air drawn into the mouth could send a jolt of searing pain through their jaw. Exposed dentin, the softer layer beneath the enamel, is highly sensitive to thermal changes, and the extreme cold of a medieval winter would have been a constant trigger. The very act of speaking outdoors or even moving too close to a drafty opening indoors could become an ordeal. People might learn to speak through clenched teeth or cover their mouths with a scarf or a hand when venturing outside, not just for warmth, but to shield their aching teeth from the direct blast of cold. The simple pleasure of drinking water, if it was icy cold from a well, could become a source of dread. Warm food and drink, if available, would be a precious comfort, not just for their caloric value, but for their soothing effect on sensitive teeth. The cold could also contribute to the cracking or crazing of already weakened enamel. Repeated exposure to extreme temperature fluctuations, moving from a relatively warm fireside to the frigid outdoors, or consuming hot pottage followed by a cold drink, could stress the tooth structure, leading to microfractures. These tiny cracks could then become pathways for bacteria, accelerating decay and increasing sensitivity. Furthermore, winter was a time when overall health often declined. Diets could become even more restricted as stored food dwindled and fresh produce disappeared. Respiratory illnesses, coughs, colds, lung infections were rampant. A body weakened by malnutrition and battling a cold would have fewer resources to combat a dental infection. A brewing abscess, perhaps manageable in warmer months, could flare up with vicious intensity during the winter, the cold seeming to concentrate the pain and inflammation. Bleeding gums, a common sign of gum disease, scurvy, exacerbated by lack of vitamin C in winter diets, also played a role. Chapped lips, another winter ailment, added to the general discomfort around the mouth. For those with missing teeth, the cold drafts could cause pain in the exposed gums and jawbone. The psychological impact of intensified tooth pain during the already bleak winter months should not be underestimated. The long, dark nights provided ample opportunity for pain to dominate one's consciousness with few distractions. The general sense of confinement and hardship associated with winter could be magnified by the constant nagging presence of a toothache, making the season feel even more oppressive and endless. In the snow-covered huts and chilly stone dwellings of medieval Europe, winter was not just a picturesque season, it was an antagonist, particularly for those with dental afflictions. The cold air was a tormentor, the dwindling light a companion to pain. The ache in the mouth became part of the broader seasonal misery, a chilling reminder of the body's vulnerability in a harsh and unforgiving environment.
A medieval dentist's toolkit. Objects of pain. Let us step, metaphorically, into the dimly lit space of a medieval barber-surgeon's establishment, or perhaps observe the supplementary tools of a village blacksmith who, by necessity, also practiced the grim art of tooth extraction. Here, laid out on a rough wooden table or kept in a worn leather roll, we would find the instruments of their trade, objects that, to our modern eyes, appear more like implements of torture than tools of healing. Their forms are stark, functional, and devoid of the refined ergonomics or sterile precision we associate with dental equipment today. Each one tells a silent story of pain endured and inflicted in the quest for relief. Perhaps the most recognizable and feared would be the pincers or forceps. These were typically made of iron or steel, heavy and robust. The beaks of these forceps varied in shape, some broad and blunt for grasping molars, others more narrow and pointed for incisors. There was little finesse in their design. They were built for a firm grip and the application of brute force. The handles were often simple, unadorned loops or straight bars, offering little in the way of comfortable purchase for the operator, let alone comfort for the patient. Rust and dried blood might cling to their surfaces, a testament to their frequent, unsterilized use. Next, we might see the dental pelican. This instrument, aptly named for its resemblance to a pelican's beak, consisted of a shaft with a curved claw or hook at one end and a bolster that rested on the adjacent teeth or gum as a fulcrum. The claw was positioned under the crown of the tooth to be extracted, and then, by levering the handle, the tooth was, ideally, lifted from its socket. However, the forces involved were immense and difficult to control. The pelican could easily slip, fracturing the tooth itself, damaging neighboring teeth, or tearing away significant portions of gum and bone. Several sizes might be present, corresponding to different teeth or patient mouths. Another key instrument, quite literally, was the dental key. This fearsome device had a claw at the end of a shaft, attached at a right angle, much like an old-fashioned door key. The shaft was often topped with a cross handle for leverage. The claw was placed over the crown of the tooth, and the bolster of the key rested on the gum. By rotating the handle, the tooth was supposed to be luxated and then lifted out. The potential for catastrophic damage with a dental key was enormous. Jaws were frequently fractured, teeth shattered, leaving roots behind, and extensive soft tissue trauma was common. Its use required immense strength and a terrifying disregard for collateral damage. Alongside these primary extraction tools, there might be various probes and elevators. Probes were slender, pointed instruments, perhaps used to explore cavities, believed to be hunting for tooth worms, or to test the looseness of a tooth. Elevators, with their flat or slightly curved blades, were designed to be wedged between the tooth root and the bone to loosen the tooth or to remove fractured roots left behind by a botched extraction. These, too, were crude and often traumatic in their application. Scalpels or lancets, sharp-bladed instruments, also used for bloodletting or lancing boils, might be employed to cut the gum tissue around a tooth to facilitate its removal, or to drain an abscess. Files, coarse and rough, could be used to smooth down a sharp edge of a broken tooth, though the process would have been agonizingly abrasive. There were no drills for removing decay, no suction devices to clear the field of blood and saliva, no mirrors for indirect vision. Anesthesia, as we know it, was entirely absent. These objects, the pelicans, keys, forceps, and probes, were the stark reality of medieval dental intervention. They sit now in museum collections, cold and silent, but they resonate with centuries of human suffering, objects of pain that nonetheless represented for many the only hope of release from an even greater agony.
Tooth legends and taboos. The human tooth, so vital for sustenance and speech, yet so prone to decay and pain, naturally became a focal point for a rich tapestry of legends, superstitions, and taboos in the medieval world. These beliefs, passed down through generations, often in hushed tones around the hearth or in the fields, reveal a deep-seated anxiety about tooth loss, a desire to control dental destiny through ritual, and a sense of the tooth as something more than just calcified tissue, as a repository of personal essence or a connection to the spiritual realm. One common set of beliefs revolved around the disposal of lost teeth, particularly children's primary teeth. The idea that a lost tooth held a part of the individual's spirit or luck was widespread. Therefore, how it was disposed of was of critical importance. Simply throwing it away carelessly was thought to invite misfortune or allow an enemy or even a malevolent spirit to gain power over the person. In some traditions, a child's lost tooth was to be thrown into the fire, a purifying element that would prevent it from being used for nefarious purposes. In others, it might be buried in a secret place, often with a specific incantation or prayer, to ensure good luck or the healthy growth of the permanent tooth. The tooth fairy concept, in its modern iteration, is a distant echo of these older, more complex rituals surrounding the transition of teeth. Animals often featured in these tooth-related legends. It was sometimes believed that if a lost tooth was given to a mouse or a rat, perhaps by placing it in their hole, the new tooth would grow in as strong and sharp as the rodent's. This practice reflected a form of sympathetic magic, hoping to imbue the new tooth with the desired qualities of the animal. Conversely, if a dog were to eat a lost tooth, it was sometimes feared that the person would grow dog-like teeth. Dreams about teeth were, and often still are, subject to potent interpretation. Dreaming of losing a tooth was almost universally considered a bad omen in medieval times, often foretelling the death of a relative or a close friend, or some other significant loss or misfortune. The specific tooth lost in the dream or the manner in which it was lost could further refine the dire prophecy. Dreaming of teeth that were white and strong, conversely, might be seen as a sign of good health, prosperity, or success. These dream interpretations underscore the symbolic weight attached to dental integrity. Taboos also existed around actions believed to cause toothache or tooth loss. Pointing at a new moon with an uncovered finger was sometimes thought to bring on a toothache. Whistling indoors after dark, or certain verbal blasphemies, could also be linked to future dental suffering in some local beliefs. These taboos served as a form of social control and a way of explaining inexplicable pain, attributing it to a transgression against a known, if unwritten, cosmic order. The seventh son of a seventh son was sometimes believed to possess innate healing powers, including the ability to cure toothache by touch or by a whispered charm. Such individuals were sought out, their perceived connection to the supernatural realm offering a glimmer of hope to those in pain. Legends also spoke of specific holy wells or sacred stones that, if visited or touched in a particular way, could alleviate dental suffering. These sites became local pilgrimage destinations for toothache sufferers. These legends and taboos, woven into the fabric of daily life, reveal how medieval people grappled with the mysteries of the body and the anxieties of existence. The tooth, in its vulnerability and its importance, became a powerful symbol, a tiny piece of self around which a rich and often fearful folklore could crystallize, reflecting a world where the magical, the spiritual, and the mundane were inextricably intertwined.
One last tooth, the quiet symbol of survival. The hearth glowed with a gentle warmth, casting flickering shadows across the small, familiar room. Old Elspeth sat on her low stool, her back bent with the weight of many seasons, her hands, gnarled and veined, resting in her lap. The evening was quiet, the sounds of the recovering village of Oakhaven muted beyond her small window. In her mouth, a solitary survivor stood sentinel. One last tooth. An old molar, worn smooth and stained with time, but still, remarkably, anchored in her jaw. It was a small, almost insignificant thing, yet for Elspeth, it had become a quiet symbol of a long life lived, of hardship endured, and of a tenacious, improbable survival. She raised a wooden cup to her lips, sipping the thin, warm broth her granddaughter had prepared. The broth, made from a few garden vegetables and perhaps a bone simmered for hours, required no chewing, yet the presence of that single tooth somehow made the act of nourishment feel more complete, a faint echo of a time when her mouth had been full of strong, capable grinders. It was a connection to her youth, to feasts remembered, to the crisp bite of an apple in autumn, to the satisfying chew of hearth-baked bread. All its companions had long since departed, victims of wear, decay, or the blacksmith's fearsome tongs. Each had been a small grief, a diminishing of her physical self, a step further into the toothless landscape of old age that was the common lot. But this one remained. It had outlasted famines that had stolen so many of her kin, winters that had frozen the very marrow, and countless meals of gritty bread that had ground down its peers. Perhaps it was simply luck, a quirk of its position or its inherent strength. Or perhaps, Elspeth sometimes mused in her quieter moments, it had held on through sheer stubbornness, a tiny testament to her own enduring spirit. It caused her no pain now, its nerve long dead, its presence a familiar if lonely fixture in her mouth. This last tooth was not a mark of vanity. In the dim light of her old age, such concerns had faded. Nor was it particularly useful for any vigorous mastication. Its significance was more profound, more personal. It was a memento of a body that had served her well, despite the privations. It was a reminder that even in an era where teeth were a fragile luxury, where smiles crumbled and pain was a constant companion, endurance was possible. It was a physical link to generations past, to her parents and grandparents who had also known the trials of the medieval mouth, and to the generations to come for whom perhaps life might be a little kinder. As she finished her broth, her tongue might gently probe the familiar contours of that solitary molar. It was a small, solid anchor in a world that had often felt precarious. It didn't represent triumph over adversity in any grand sense, but rather a quiet, persistent continuity. In a society where losing all one's teeth was an expected part of growing old, to retain even one into advanced age was a small personal victory, a subtle defiance against the pervasive decay of the times. The fire crackled softly. Elspeth closed her eyes, a sense of peace settling over her. Her one last tooth, a tiny, unassuming monument, was a symbol not of what was lost, but of what had, against all odds, remained. It was a quiet testament to the resilience of the human body and spirit, a final, steadfast companion on the long journey through a life where having even a single tooth to call one's own could, in the end, feel like a gentle, enduring blessing.